The fog rolled across the Frostvale Highlands the way it always had. Slow, heavy, the kind of fog that remembered things long after the living had tried to forget them. Below it stood Blackthorn Manor, stone walls, dark windows, iron gates draped in climbing vines that had grown so thick over the years, they looked less like decoration and more like something reaching. Like the house itself had grown hands and learned how to hold its secrets close. And in the northern tower, behind a pane of glass that had not opened in 7 years, a woman stood watching. Her name was Faith Everwin. She was 20 years old, and she had been standing at that window since she was 13. Not every minute, not every hour, but long enough that the stone ledge had worn smooth beneath her palms. Long enough that the thin crack running along the lower corner of the glass had become something familiar. Something she greeted every morning the way a lonely child greets a photograph of someone who never visits. The room behind her told its own story. Books stacked in towers along every wall. Dried herbs hanging in careful bundles from the ceiling beams. Lavender, wolfsbane, moon petal, healer's bark. Candles in various stages of burning lined the windowsill, their wax pooled into small rivers that had hardened and gone cold overnight. Sketches pinned to the plaster, birds she had seen from the window, constellations mapped from memory, a portrait of her father's face drawn from a memory she refused to let fade. The servants who still slipped her meals through the lower hatch believed Faith Everwin spent her days weeping. They were wrong. She spent her days watching. 7 years behind a locked door had sharpened something in her that isolation usually destroyed. She had learned to read the world from a distance. The way a man held his shoulders when he was afraid versus when he was simply tired. The way horses behaved differently around men they trusted. The way smoke from chimneys curled lower in the morning when weather was turning. She had learned that power rarely needed to announce itself, and she had learned that the absence of things told you more than the things themselves. The absence of visitors, the absence of letters, the absence of her name spoken aloud in any room she could hear. 7 years of absences, and she had built something inside each one. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. The morning was October grey, the sky pressing low over the hills, like it had somewhere important to be, and couldn't quite leave. Faith stood at the window with a cup of cooled tea in her hands, watching the road the way she watched it every morning. The eastern road wound through the valley in a slow curve, disappearing into the tree line a quarter-mile from the manor gates. In 7 years, she had seen merchants pass, seasonal workers, messengers with their heads tucked low against the wind, the occasional noble carriage flying house colors like a declaration. None of them had stopped. None of them had looked up. She lifted her eyes toward the distant hilltop, where the fog still clung in thick ribbons. And then, something moved. She went still. A carriage. Dark horses. Well kept. The kind that belonged to a man who understood the difference between display and performance. 2 riders flanking from behind, one ahead. And the carriage itself was plain in a way that was almost conspicuous. No house crest on the door, no colored lanterns, no traveling standard, no announcement. Faith leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging the pain. She had learned, over years of watching strangers on that road, that men who didn't need to announce themselves were always more dangerous than men who did. The carriage slowed as it reached the lower gate, and then it stopped. The door opened. A man stepped out into the grey October light. He wore a plain traveling cloak, dark and road-dusty, fur-lined at the collar in a way that was practical rather than decorative. His boots were worn at the heel, no traveling hat, which, in a kingdom where men of rank almost always wore them, was the kind of detail Faith had learned not to overlook. He stood very still for a moment, looking up at the face of the manor. He studied it the way a careful man studies anything, quietly, without hurry, as if he already understood that rushing through observation cost you later. Then, as though he could feel the weight of someone watching, he looked up, not at the manor in general, not at the stone face or the iron gates, or the dark windows on the lower floors. He looked directly at the northern tower. He looked directly at her. For one heartbeat, everything stopped. The fog, the wind, the distant sound of a horse shifting its weight on the gravel below. All of it fell away, and Faith stood with her cold tea, and her hands pressed flat against the glass. And the man in the plain cloak stood in the grey morning light with his eyes lifted. And he did not look away. She had expected it. The usual flicker of surprise, then the polite, embarrassed redirect of a man remembering he wasn't supposed to notice the tower. She had seen it before, on the few occasions when someone looked up at all. But this man did not redirect. He simply looked at her, long enough that Faith felt it somewhere behind her ribs. Long enough that for the first time in 7 years, she forgot to breathe carefully. Then he turned and walked toward the front gates. Not hurrying, not announcing himself, simply entering. Faith's hand remained flat against the glass. Her pulse was strange in her chest. Not fearful exactly, something older than fear, the particular feeling of a woman who had learned to survive silence, now standing at the edge of something that was not silent at all. She had spent 7 years watching that road, 7 years waiting for proof that the world still turned beyond these walls. 7 years behind glass that had not opened, and not once, had anyone stopped at that gate, looked up at this tower, and truly seen the woman standing in it. Until now. Her breath left a soft circle of fog on the cold glass, and somewhere below, she heard the front door of Blackthorn Manor open for the first time in a very long while. She didn't know yet who he was. She didn't know yet what he would change. She only knew one thing, with absolute certainty. After 7 years behind locked glass, someone had finally looked up. The name spread through Blackthorn Manor the way cold did. Through the cracks first, then everywhere. Alpha King, Nathan Ashbourne. By the time the front doors had closed behind him, 3 servants had already disappeared into back corridors, and Lady Eleanor Everwyn had pressed both hands flat against the parlour table, as though she needed something solid to hold her upright. In the Moonvale Kingdom, men spoke Nathan Ashbourne's name carefully, the way you handle a blade you respect. He had taken the throne at 19, inheriting a kingdom bleeding from 3 simultaneous border wars, and he had ended all 3 within 18 months. Not through cruelty alone, though his enemies were always careful to say otherwise, but through the particular combination of patience and precision that unnerved men far more than rage ever could. Rage you could anticipate. Patience you couldn't. He was 32 now, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone making a point. He moved through rooms the way powerful men always did, as though the room had been waiting for him to arrive and give it purpose. But people who studied him closely noticed something the stories never mentioned. He remembered names. Every servant, every stable hand, every injured guard on the outer wall. He knew their names, their children's names, the small, complicated details of their small, complicated lives. Cold men didn't do that. Cold men didn't kneel beside injured pups in the courtyard or carry letters personally to grieving widows on the border territories. The world had decided Nathan Ashbourne was frightening, and they were right. But they had chosen the wrong reason. He had come to Blackthorn Manor on official business. A territorial boundary dispute between the Everwyn estate and the neighbouring Duskfield pack had been escalating for months, generating enough legal noise that it required a royal representative's presence to settle. Nathan had chosen to come himself, rather than send an envoy. He hadn't been sure, until now, why. Cedric Everwyn met him in the entrance hall, a tall man in his mid-30s with good posture and nervous hands. Nathan noticed the hands immediately, the way they kept moving to Cedric's sides, then back together, then apart again. A man managing something. "Your Majesty," Cedric bowed. "We are honored." Nathan looked past him. The manor felt wrong in the way that houses felt wrong when they had been organized specifically around concealment. Too tidy in some places, too neglected in others. The eastern corridor was sealed with a locked door that had no dust on its handle, recently used then. but the servants moved past it without glancing at it, which meant they had been trained not to notice things. Nathan noticed everything. They moved into the main sitting room. Lady Eleanor appeared shortly after, dressed carefully, her smile precise, and positioned like something she had rehearsed. She was a handsome woman who had learned, over many years, how to make her fear look like composure. Nathan had grown up watching his mother perform the same trick. He accepted tea he didn't intend to drink, and they spoke for 40 minutes about the boundary dispute. Acreage, pack law, the relevant council rulings, the appropriate documentation. Cedric handled it adequately, professionally even, but his hands never stopped moving, and Lady Eleanor's eyes kept pulling, briefly, involuntarily, toward the ceiling, upward, toward something above them. Nathan set down his cup. "The territorial matter is straightforward enough," he said. "We'll have it resolved by morning." A pause, deliberate, quiet. "Tell me about the woman in the northern tower." The room stopped breathing. Cedric's hands went completely still, for the first time since Nathan had arrived. Lady Eleanor's composure flickered. Just once, just briefly, like a candle in a draught. Then Eleanor smiled again. "The northern tower, Your Majesty?" Her voice was smooth, almost convincing. "That part of the manor has been abandoned for years. There's nothing up there." Nathan looked at her. He didn't speak immediately. He had learned, young, that silence applied at the right moment told you more than any question could. He watched Eleanor hold her smile together with visible effort. He watched Cedric stare at a fixed point on the floor. He thought about a palace bedroom with the curtains always drawn. A woman who asked to go outside and was told, gently, firmly, repeatedly, that it wasn't safe. A boy of 9 who believed them because boys of 9 believed their elders. A woman who died quiet and invisible, while a kingdom watched and called it tragedy. Nathan set down his cup. "I wasn't asking," he said simply. The servant who led him up the northern staircase kept his eyes forward and his shoulders rigid. Behind them, Nathan could hear Cedric following at a distance, not close enough to suggest authority, not far enough to suggest he'd been dismissed. The lock on the tower door was heavy iron, old, but oiled. Someone had been maintaining it. Nathan took the key from the servant's trembling hand, and without ceremony, without announcement, he turned it. The mechanism released with a sound that echoed down the stone corridor. In the room above, Faith Everwin was sitting beside her window. Her book was open, her tea was cold, and then she heard it. A sound she had nearly forgotten. The lock, turning. The door swung inward on silent hinges. Nathan stepped through and stopped. He had expected many things, squalor perhaps. The particular kind of neglect that came from years of deliberate abandonment. Bare walls, a thin mattress, a room that had been stripped of anything that might make a person comfortable enough to stay sane. What he found instead was something that took him a moment to understand. Books. Everywhere. Stacked in careful columns along every wall, organized in a system he could see had logic to it. Healers' texts on the left, histories in the center, philosophical treatises nearest the window where the light was best. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams in precise bundles, each tied with a different color of thread. Lavender, moon petal, healer's bark, wolfsbane. The sketches pinned to the plaster were detailed enough to be professional. Birds rendered feather by feather, constellations mapped with deliberate accuracy. A man's face drawn from memory with such careful love that Nathan felt, looking at it, that he was intruding on something private. Journals lined the shelf beside the fireplace. Dozens of them, candles at every surface, a mortar and pestle, small glass bottles stoppered with wax, labeled in a handwriting that was small and precise and certain. This was not a prison cell. This was a scholar's study, built by someone who had refused, quietly and stubbornly, to become what captivity wanted her to be. Nathan turned. Faith Everwin stood beside the window, still, composed. Her silver gold hair fell loose around her shoulders, and her dress was old but clean. Her chin at an angle that was not quite defiant and not quite proud, something more complicated than either. Something that looked like a woman who had decided, long ago, that she would not shrink simply because the room was small. She was watching him the way she had watched him from above, carefully, completely. Nathan looked at Lady Eleanor. He did not look at Faith's face. He did not remark on the room, or the years, or the obvious truth crowding every corner of it. He simply asked, quietly, "How long?" Eleanor opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The silence stretched long enough to answer the question on its own. "Leave us," Nathan said. He did not approach her. He crossed the room, moved the journals from the chair nearest the fireplace, and sat, as though he had been invited, as though this was simply where the conversation was going to happen, and they might as well be comfortable. Faith watched him for a moment. Then she sat across from him. The fire between them was low but steady. He didn't speak first. He simply waited, with the particular quality of patience that Faith had only ever read about in the histories of men who understood that silence was not empty, that it was, sometimes, the kindest thing you could offer someone who had spent years not being heard. So she spoke, slowly at first, carefully, testing each word like a step on uncertain ground. She told him about the first year, how she had cried until crying became boring and then became useless, how she had started reading simply to have somewhere to put her mind, how Wren, the youngest of the kitchen maids, had begun sliding extra candles beneath the door along with the meal trays. Extra candles, then paper, then books, requested in whispers through the hatch, how Wren had never once asked for anything in return. She told him about the herbs, how she had started growing them on the windowsill out of curiosity and realized within months that she had healer's hands, that the knowledge came to her naturally, practically, the way some things simply did when you had quiet enough to hear them. She told him about watching the road, the window, the people, the things she had learned to read from a distance. Nathan listened. He asked occasional questions, short, precise, never redirecting, never filling silence with his own comfort. He simply listened with the complete attention of a man who understood that listening was not passive, that it required something from you. Faith noticed that he never looked at her the way men usually looked at her when they caught glimpse of her through the hatch or the window. He didn't look at her face and stop thinking. He looked at her and kept thinking. She noticed she appreciated it more than she could easily explain. The fire had burned lower when Wren, permitted upstairs by Nathan's quiet instruction to a guard, brought tea without being asked. Faith wrapped both hands around the cup. She used to hide notes in the tea tin, Faith said. Notes about what? Everything happening outside. A pause. News. Gossip. Who married whom? Which council votes had passed? She glanced down at her cup. She thought it was small comfort. Was it? It was the only reason I knew the world was still moving. She looked up. Small things aren't small when they're all you have. Something shifted in Nathan's expression. Not pity. Something older and quieter than pity. Then Faith said something she hadn't intended to say. It came out the way true things sometimes did, without ceremony, without preparation, simply arriving because the silence was finally safe enough to hold it. She almost smiled at his expression. Then she said, 7 years is a long time to be invisible. And Nathan, who had not smiled once since entering Blackthorn Manor, came very close. The fire crackled. Outside, the fog had lifted off the highlands. Faith set down her cup. Her voice dropped. I need to tell you something else. Nathan waited. I know who killed my father. The fire kept burning. But Nathan Ashbourne went completely still. Faith didn't wait for him to respond. She crossed the room, moved to the far corner behind the writing desk, and knelt. Her hands found the edge of a floorboard, the third from the wall, slightly darker than the others from years of careful handling, and pulled. It came up quietly, as though it had been designed to. Beneath it was a hollow the size of a traveling trunk, and it was full. Nathan rose from his chair without thinking and came to stand beside her. Letters, dozens of them, bundled in careful stacks and tied with plain thread. Ledgers, 3 of them, their spines worn smooth, filled with columns of figures in 2 different handwritings, journals with dates running back 4 years, and beneath those, folded documents covered in a coded shorthand that Nathan recognized, with quiet astonishment, as the financial notation system used exclusively by the Moonvale High Council's Eastern trade offices. He looked at Faith. She looked back at him. 3 years, she said simply. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the hollow in the floor hadn't already said better. She had not spent 7 years waiting. She had spent 7 years preparing. They moved to the table. Nathan cleared the journals to one side, while Faith organized the letters by date, her hands moving through the stacks with the practiced certainty of someone who had spent years handling these documents. So many times, they had memorized the order. "His name is Lord Magnus Ravenscar," she said. Nathan went still. He knew the name. Everyone in Moonvale did. Magnus Ravenscar, Alpha Lord of the Eastern Territories, the most influential noble seat outside the Royal Council itself. A man whose political reach extended into trade, law, military contracts, and border governance. A man who had spent 2 decades positioning himself as indispensable. A man Nathan had never fully trusted. "Show me," he said. Faith opened the first ledger. The figures were meticulous. Over 6 years, large sums had moved out of the Everwin estate accounts, not stolen outright, which would have been traceable, but redirected. Fees for services never rendered. Payments to contractors who didn't exist. Percentages quietly absorbed by shell accounts that connected, through 4 layers of financial distance, to the Ravenscar trading house. The second ledger showed the same pattern from the opposite direction. Incoming funds, manipulated to look like Cedric's personal investments, making him look complicit, whether he knew it or not. Cedric didn't understand what he was signing, Faith said quietly. Magnus made sure of that. He introduced himself as a financial advisor the year after my father died. Cedric was grieving, overwhelmed. Magnus offered to manage things. She paused. He was very generous about it. Nathan's jaw tightened. He controlled everything within 18 months, Faith continued. The estate income, the council voting proxy, the staff appointments. And when he had enough leverage, she unfolded a letter. He began making threats. The letter was addressed to Lady Eleanor. The language was courteous. The meaning was not. The continued well-being of your household depends upon your continued discretion. A woman of your standing understands that certain arrangements, once made, cannot be unmade without consequence. Nathan read it twice. There are 11 letters like that, Faith said. To my mother, to Cedric, to the estate physician. She laid them out in a row. He built a cage out of fear, and then he put everyone inside it, including you. Especially me. She was quiet for a moment. Magnus Ravenscar has a son, she said. Dorian. He's 30 now. Was 23 when my father was still alive. Her voice remained even, carefully, deliberately even. At a council dinner, I was 13. Dorian announced to the table that I would one day belong to their family. He said it the way men say things they've already decided. Nathan looked at her. That was the last dinner I attended, Faith said. The same week. It wasn't a question. The same week, she confirmed. The fire made the only sound in the room. Nathan reached across the table to pull the nearest ledger closer, and Faith reached at the same moment to steady the stack beside it, and their hands met briefly over the documents. Neither of them moved away immediately. Neither of them mentioned it. After a moment, Nathan turned the ledger page, and then he stopped. Tucked inside the back cover, pressed flat, folded twice, the paper older and softer than everything around it, was a journal, smaller than the others. The initials on the cover were stamped in worn gold. A.E. Alaric Everwin. Faith's breath changed. Nathan lifted it carefully and opened to the final pages. And there, pressed between the last 2 leaves of her father's handwriting, was a document. Formal, witnessed, sealed. A will. A second will. Different from the one that had been read after Lord Alaric's death. Completely different. Faith's hand came up slowly and covered her mouth, and Nathan read it once, then read it again, then looked up at her with something in his expression that was not astonishment. It was fury. Quiet, absolute, controlled fury. The most dangerous kind. The will was 12 pages long. Lord Alaric Everwyn had written it by hand, not through a council scribe, not through the estate solicitor. By his own hand, in the careful, deliberate penmanship of a man who understood that some things were too important to pass through other people's fingers. Nathan read it in full. Faith stood beside him and read it with him, and neither of them spoke until the last page. Everything. The Everwyn estate, the lands, the vineyards along the southern ridge, the northern timber holdings, the trade routes, the council seat, the financial reserves, all of it. Not to Cedric, to Faith, entirely and without condition, to Faith Mara Everwyn. Upon her 21st birthday, or upon evidence of her father's unnatural death, whichever came first, beneath the estate provisions, in smaller writing that looked like it had been added later, perhaps in a different hour, a different mood, were her father's final words. If I die unexpectedly, trust no one wearing the Ravenscar crest. I should have protected her sooner. I am sorry I did not. She was always the strongest of us. I knew it from the beginning. I should have said it more often while I still could. Faith read those lines 3 times. Then she stopped reading. Nathan set the document down. He placed both hands flat on the table, and for a moment, he simply stood there with his head lowered, not in grief, in something colder and more deliberate than grief. He had this for 3 years, he said quietly. Yes, Magnus Ravenscar has controlled an estate that legally belongs to you, has kept you imprisoned in a tower of a house that is legally yours. A pause. For 3 years. Yes. Nathan lifted his head. The fury in his expression was the quiet kind, banked low, completely controlled, which made it considerably more frightening than if he had raised his voice. He crossed to the door and opened it. Cedric was in the corridor. He had clearly been standing there for some time. His posture had collapsed somewhere between the sitting room and this moment. The good posture gone, the managed expression gone, replaced by something rawer and less practiced. He looked like a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and had finally, in the presence of a witness, run out of the strength to keep holding it. Nathan looked at him. "Come in," he said, simply, without anger, which was somehow worse. Cedric crossed the room and stood before his sister. He didn't look at Nathan. He didn't look at the documents on the table or the open floorboard in the corner. He looked at Faith, and then, quietly, without warning, without dramatics, he broke. "He told me he would kill you." His voice came out stripped of everything. Rank, pride, the years of careful distance. He said it plainly. The week after Father died, he came to me privately and he told me, if I didn't cooperate, if I didn't maintain the arrangement, if I told anyone what he was doing. Cedric stopped, pressed his hand briefly against his eyes. He said you would simply disappear, that it would look like grief, like instability, that no one would question it. Faith was very still. "I told myself I was protecting you," Cedric said. "I told myself the tower was safer than what he might do otherwise. I told myself it was temporary." He exhaled. "I told myself so many things for so many years that I stopped being able to hear how they sounded." His voice broke on the last word, and Faith watched her brother cry. For the first time in 7 years, she didn't speak immediately. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, completely, carefully, with the particular patience of a woman who had spent years learning that most people were not what they appeared to be. Not better, not worse, just more complicated. "I know," she said finally, softly. That was all. Later, after Cedric had gone, Nathan remained by the fireplace. He spoke without turning around. "My mother spent the last 4 years of her life in a room inside the royal palace." His voice was quiet, factual in the way that difficult things became factual once you'd carried them long enough. "They called her fragile, unstable, said the outside world distressed her." A pause. "She was 31 when she died. I was 9. I believed everything they told me, because I didn't know yet that adults lied about the things that mattered most." Faith moved to stand beside him. She didn't offer comfort in words. She simply stood close enough that he could feel she was there. After a moment, his shoulder dropped slightly. A small thing, enormous. Their walls did not fall that night, but something shifted in the space between them, something quiet and permanent, the way foundations shifted, invisibly, underground, before anything above the surface had changed at all. Then a knock came at the door. A servant, pale-faced, breathing too quickly. "Your Majesty." He looked at Nathan, then at Faith. "Lord Magnus Ravenscar has arrived." The fireplace crackled. Neither of them moved. Then Nathan straightened slowly, and Faith lifted her chin. Lord Magnus Ravenscar arrived the way he always arrived, as though the space had been expecting him. He was 60, broad through the chest, with silver hair worn long, and the particular bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades ensuring that other people moved out of his way before he reached them. He wore the Ravenscar crest openly, a black raven on deep crimson, and he smiled as he crossed the threshold into Blackthorn Manor, with the ease of someone entering a room they already considered theirs. He had not been invited. He hadn't needed to be. Not until now. The library doors were open. Magnus stepped through them, still speaking. Something about the territorial matter, about his eagerness to assist the crown, about what a fortunate coincidence that he happened to be traveling nearby. Then he saw her. The words stopped. Not gradually, not with the slow fade of a man reconsidering his approach. They simply stopped. Faith Everwin stood at the far end of the library table, wearing a plain grey dress, with her silver gold hair loose, both hands resting quietly at her sides. Beside her, slightly behind, stood Alpha King Nathan Ashbourne, with his arms crossed and his expression perfectly neutral, in the way that Nathan's expressions were always perfectly neutral when he was paying very close attention. Magnus looked at Faith. Faith looked at Magnus. She did not smile. She did not flinch. She simply stood in the room that legally belonged to her and waited for him to remember how to breathe. The smile disappeared from Magnus Ravenscar's face for the first time in longer than most people could remember. Then he recovered, because men like Magnus always recovered. "Lady Faith." His voice was smooth, measured, a single beat slower than usual. "I had heard you were unwell. I'm relieved to see you looking." "Sit down," Faith said. Not loudly, not unkindly, but with the absolute certainty of a woman in her own home. Magnus looked at Nathan. Nathan said nothing, which told Magnus everything he needed to know about how this conversation was going to proceed. He sat. Faith placed the documents on the table one at a time. The second will, her father's journal, Cedric's signed confession, the financial ledgers, the letters to her mother, the coded accounts, the witness statements from 3 estate servants and the former Everwin estate physician, gathered over 3 years through Wren, and quietly notarized through a council clerk who owed Wren's family a debt. She placed them without commentary. Let each one land in the silence. Magnus looked at the documents, the way men looked at things they had believed safely buried. Then he laughed. It was a good laugh. Practiced. The laugh of a man who had spent decades using amusement as armor. "You have been busy," he said. His eyes moved to Nathan. "You understand this is the imagination of a woman who has spent 7 years isolated and—" "She's been speaking for 10 minutes, Nathan said quietly. "I'd suggest you listen." Magnus closed his mouth. Faith continued. She walked him through the ledgers, the redirected accounts, the shell contractors, the 4-layered financial architecture built to drain the Everwin estate while making Cedric appear complicit. She explained the timeline. The council dinner, where Dorian Ravenscar had announced his intentions. The week that followed, her voice remained even throughout. No tremor, no theatrics, just truth, laid out with the precision of someone who had spent 3 years ensuring it was airtight. Magnus's composure eroded the way expensive things eroded. Slowly, expensively, in ways he tried to make look like something other than damage. "This is circumstantial," he said. "Letters can be fabricated. Ledgers can be altered. The word of a woman who has been—" "Locked in a tower?" Faith said. He stopped. I'm aware of what I've been, she said. I'm also aware of what I spent those years becoming. She picked up the second will and held it toward him. Her father's seal caught the light. This document gives me the estate, the council seat, and the legal standing to bring every one of these documents before the High Council. A pause. Which I intend to do. Magnus rose from his chair. The smile he produced was the ugliest version of itself, stripped of charm, showing what lived underneath. You think beauty makes you powerful, he said. Faith stepped forward. He had not expected that. No, she said softly. Truth does. For one suspended moment, Magnus Ravenscar, the most powerful Alpha Lord in the Eastern Territories, the man who had controlled this estate for 6 years through fear and financial manipulation, took one step backward. He didn't appear to notice he had done it, but Nathan did, and Faith did. Magnus straightened, buttoned his coat, produced the remnants of his smile. This isn't finished, he said. No, Faith agreed. It isn't. He left without being escorted, and the room held its silence until his footsteps faded. Then Nathan looked at Faith. He'll move tonight, he said quietly. Faith was already turning toward the fireplace. I know, she said. Then we should be ready. We are, she said. And she meant it. They came at the 3rd hour after midnight. No announcement. No approach sounds on the gravel. Only the guard dogs going suddenly, completely silent, which was worse. And then the eastern gate shattering inward like it had been struck by something that did not stop to consider whether gates were supposed to hold against it. Nathan was already moving when the first shout came up from the courtyard. He had expected it. When Magnus Ravenscar left a room vowing quiet revenge, he didn't wait. Men like Magnus understood that momentum was a weapon, that the window between humiliation and consequence was narrow and needed to be used before it closed. He had sent 8 rogue wolves, large, coordinated, the kind of hired force that left nothing on paper connecting it to the man who paid for it. Nathan met the first 2 in the corridor outside the library. It was brief, and it was not clean, and when it was finished, he moved toward the eastern staircase, where his own guards were engaging the remaining 6 near the servant quarters. What he did not expect, what stopped him at the top of the stairs, was Faith. She was already below him in the entrance hall, not hiding, not fleeing toward the tower. She had pulled the medical case from the kitchen stores and knelt beside a young guard, barely 18 from the look of him, who had taken a blow to the shoulder that had dislocated it badly and was bleeding at the temple from where he'd struck the stone floor going down. Stay still, she said. Her voice was calm in the specific way of someone trained to be calm, not someone feeling it. I need you to breathe slowly. This will hurt for exactly 1 second. It did. Then the shoulder was back. The guard made a sound that was half pain, half astonishment. Faith was already moving to the next man. Nathan watched her for 2 seconds. Only 2. And in those 2 seconds, he understood something about Faith Everwin, that the tower, and the books, and the evidence beneath the floorboards had not fully communicated. She was not someone who had survived captivity. She was someone who had spent captivity building toward exactly this. Everwin, he said sharply. She looked up. Stay visible to my guards, he said. Not hidden, visible, so they know where you are. She held his gaze, then nodded. He went back into the fight. It ended within the hour. 6 of the rogue wolves were restrained. 2 had fled into the western tree line, where Nathan's outriders ran them to ground before dawn. The manor had damage along the eastern corridor and the gate. 3 guards with injuries ranging from serious to manageable, and 1 casualty, a senior guardsman named Aldrich, 20 years in Everwin service, who had held the entrance hall long enough for the others to position, and whom Faith could not save, because she hadn't reached him in time. She had tried. Nathan found her afterward in the main hall, kneeling beside where Aldrich had fallen, her hands in her lap, and her expression doing the thing it did when she was feeling something she had decided not to perform. He sat beside her on the cold stone floor. Neither of them spoke for a while. It was Faith who noticed the wound, a cut along Nathan's left side, deep enough the kind that came from something that had gotten closer than it should have. He had not mentioned it. He had not been going to mention it. She saw the way he held himself when he sat and said, simply, "Take off your coat." He looked at her. Nathan. He took off his coat. She worked in the library beside the fireplace, which was the warmest room with the best remaining light. She was methodical and precise, and she didn't make conversation while she worked, which he appreciated. She cleaned it, assessed it, made a decision about closure that she explained briefly, and then carried out with her healer's hands. Quick, certain, confident. He didn't make a sound. She glanced up at that. "Most men make a sound," she said. "I'm aware." Something close to amusement crossed her face. When she finished, she washed her hands in the basin Ren had brought and sat back in the chair across from him. The fire had settled to a steady low burn. The manor was quiet in the particular way of a place that had been loud and was still recovering. Nathan leaned back and was asleep within 10 minutes. Faith watched him. This man, the most feared ruler in the Moonvale Kingdom, the man whose enemies spoke his name carefully, the man who had walked into a locked tower without asking permission and listened to her for hours without flinching, asleep in her library chair, with his coat folded over his arm and his face, in sleep, entirely unguarded. She took the blanket from the reading couch, settled it over him, stood back. He opened his eyes. Just briefly, just long enough. "I was afraid of losing you," he said quietly. "The way people said things that came out before they had decided to say them. Before I even knew your favorite flower." The firelight was warm on her face. Faith felt the blush before she could prevent it. "Moonflowers," she said softly. His eyes closed again, and Faith sat back down with her book and read until morning came. They received word at dawn. Magnus Ravenscar had been intercepted at the northern border crossing, attempting to reach the eastern territories before news of the night's events could travel ahead of him. Nathan's outriders had been waiting. He was in custody before the sun fully cleared the highlands, and in the library of Blackthorn Manor, over cold tea and scattered legal documents, Nathan and Faith began to prepare for trial. The High Council chamber in Velmore City had seen many things in its 400 years. Wars declared, treaties signed, titles stripped and stripped again. The particular theatre of powerful men deciding the shape of other people's lives from behind a long table with very good lighting. It had not seen anything quite like this. 40 Alpha Lords, seated in the tiered gallery that curved around the chamber floor in a horseshoe. 40 men representing the full breadth of Moonvale's noble pack structure. Eastern Territories, Western Highlands, Northern Border Clans, the coastal seats. Men who had spent their careers being the most significant presence in any room they entered. The chamber filled with the low murmur of men who had read the preliminary documents and were still deciding what to make of them. Then the doors at the far end opened. Faith walked in alone. She wore grey, simple wool, well cut, nothing decorative, no jewels at her throat or her wrists, no house colours, no symbolic crest, no crown borrowed from anyone else's authority. Her silver gold hair was pinned simply. Her hands were at her sides. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had decided that the truth was enough to wear and had dressed accordingly. The murmur in the gallery faded. She walked the full length of the chamber floor to the speaker's position, without hurrying, without looking at the gallery, without performing composure. She simply had it. The specific composure of someone who had spent 7 years in a quiet room, learning the difference between what was essential and what wasn't. She reached the podium. She looked up at 40 Alpha Lords, and she began. She started with the small things. The wooden sill worn smooth under her palms, the crack in the corner of the tower glass that she had greeted every morning for 7 years. The way Wren folded the notes so they fit beneath the tea-tin lid without crinkling. The particular quality of silence in a room where you are the only person who knows you exist. She did not perform the grief of it. She simply described it. And somehow that was worse. Somehow a plain account of a locked door, and 7 winters seen through glass, and a father's handwriting on the final pages of a hidden journal, landed with more weight than any prepared speech could have carried. The gallery was very still. She spoke of her mother, not with bitterness, but with the clear-eyed accuracy of a daughter who had taken the long view and understood that fear made people capable of things love had not prepared them for. She spoke of Cedric with the same precision, of what cowardice looked like from the inside of the room it created. She named Magnus Ravenscar once, then did not name him again, because she was not here for him. She brought forward the evidence methodically, the second will, the financial ledgers, the letters, the coded accounts, and walked the council through each one with the thoroughness of a woman who had spent 3 years ensuring that what she built could not be dismantled by men who would try. Cedric spoke. Then Eleanor, her voice thin but steady, in the way of someone attempting to be, for the first time, worth the attempt. Then Wren, who stood before 40 Alpha Lords in her kitchen maid's dress, and did not apologize for either, and the estate servants, and the physicians, and the council clerk who had notarized the witness statements, and was deeply unhappy about being present, but had shown up nonetheless. When they finished, Faith returned to the podium. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am not here to ask for sympathy. I am not here because of what was done to me." A pause. "I am here because what was done to me will be done to someone else's daughter next week, and the week after that, and every week following, unless this council decides today that it will not." The chamber was absolutely silent. "The strongest souls are not those untouched by suffering," she said. "They are the ones who keep their kindness after surviving it." She stepped back from the podium. "I kept mine," she said simply. "I would like the law to keep it too." 40 Alpha Lords rose. Not immediately, not as a coordinated gesture. One at a time, beginning with the eldest lord in the northern gallery, and moving through the chamber the way a tide moved. Unhurried, complete, inevitable. 40 men. Hands over their hearts. Not for her face, not for her bloodline or her estate, or the political calculus of aligning with the Alpha King's apparent interests. For the woman who had spent 7 years behind locked glass building something that could not be imprisoned. For courage. Magnus Ravenscar was stripped of his title before the sun moved. His lands, his council seat, his eastern trading rights, dissolved. His exile was permanent and without condition, witnessed by 40 signatures and sealed by royal authority before the chamber cleared. He was escorted out without ceremony. He did not look at Faith as he passed. She did not look at him either. There was nothing left there worth looking at. The Everwin Act was formally proposed that same afternoon, introduced by the eldest council member and co-signed by 37 of the 40 lords before evening. No woman in the Moonvale Kingdom may be confined against her will, under any claim of protection, family arrangement or noble custom. It would become law within the month. Nathan left for the capital 3 days later. The kingdom required him. It always did. He stood at the Blackthorn gates in the grey morning and said very little, because Nathan Ashbourne had never needed many words to say something completely, and Faith stood at the top of the manor steps and said very little back. He left, and 2 weeks later, the first letter arrived. Long, unhurried, written in handwriting that was smaller and more careful than Faith had expected, as though he had thought about each sentence before committing it. She read it twice, then sat down and wrote back. Spring came slowly to the Frostvale Highlands, the way good things came, after hard years, not announcing itself, not arriving all at once, just a gradual softening at the edges, the frost thinning, the morning light lasting a little longer each day, the climbing vines along the manor walls putting out small green shoots that had no urgency about them whatsoever. Faith noticed them from the northern tower on the first morning she opened the window. She opened it on a Tuesday in late March, for no particular reason except that she decided to, and the cold air came in smelling of thawed earth and pine, and something indefinably alive. She stood there for a long time. Then she left the window open and went downstairs to begin the work. The tower room took 3 weeks to transform. The iron bars came down first, then the heavy curtains. Then the small, mean furniture that had been chosen. She understood now, specifically because it offered no comfort, nothing that might make captivity feel sustainable. In their place, proper shelves, floor to ceiling, built by two estate carpenters who worked without asking questions because Wren had briefed them thoroughly, and Wren's briefings left very little room for questions. Books came up from the study, from storage, from the donations of 3 neighbouring estates, whose lords had voted for the Everwin Act and wanted to do something useful with the feeling it left behind. By April, the northern tower was a library. Its windows, both of them, the old one and the new one, cut into the eastern wall to let in the morning light, stayed open. Always. The Everwin Act became law on the 14th of April. Faith read the official proclamation in the main hall, surrounded by Wren, 2 estate servants, and her mother. And when she finished reading, she folded it carefully and placed it in the tower library on the shelf she had designated for things that mattered. It sat between her father's journal and the first letter Nathan had sent. The letters came every week, Wednesday mornings, without exception, arriving with the regular post in Nathan's small, deliberate handwriting on plain paper, with no royal seal. A choice she had noticed immediately and said nothing about. He wrote about the kingdom, cases before the council, border negotiations, a rogue pack dispute in the Northern Territories that had taken 3 weeks to resolve, and considerable patience. He wrote about the injured guard from the Blackthorn attack, the young one, barely 18, who had recovered fully and been assigned, at Nathan's personal recommendation, to the Royal Palace Training Corps. He wrote, occasionally, about smaller things, a book he had read and disagreed with, the particular quality of light over the capital in winter versus in spring, a dog that had followed his carriage for 2 miles outside the eastern city gates and been persuaded to stop only through the diplomatic application of dried meat from his traveling pack. He never wrote about what he felt, he never pushed, never claimed, never asked for anything from her at all. He simply stayed, in the only way available to a man, 3 days' ride from the woman he was thinking about. He stayed through paper and ink, and Wednesday mornings. He stayed through the specific discipline of a man who understood that some things could not be reached for, that they had to be arrived at freely or not at all. Faith understood what he was doing. She understood it so completely, and with such precise recognition, that it undid her far more efficiently than declarations would have. She had read about love in her tower library, had formed from books a working theory of what it was. The grand gestures, the impossible sacrifices, the thunderclap recognition. She had not read about this. About a man who gave you your freedom first, and then simply made himself available within it, who never positioned himself between you and the door, who wrote you letters about a dog that followed his carriage because he thought it might make you smile and didn't need to know whether it had. Faith fell in love the way the spring had come to the Highlands, without announcement, without urgency, just a gradual, inevitable warmth at the edges of everything. He came back in October, a year, almost exactly, from the morning he had stepped out of a plain carriage in the grey October light and looked up at a tower window. The roses along the southern garden wall had been Faith's project through the summer, white climbing roses, planted in June, which had no business being in bloom by October, and yet somehow were. Wren maintained they had simply decided to cooperate, and Faith had learned not to argue with Wren about things she felt strongly about. They were standing in the garden when he arrived. He came around the eastern path without ceremony, in a plain travelling cloak with dusty boots, and he stopped when he saw her among the white roses in the last of the evening light. He stood there for a moment. Then he crossed the garden, and he stood before her, and the man who rarely needed many words to say something completely said nothing at all for a long moment. Then Faith. Yes. Would you allow me to spend the rest of my life earning the privilege of standing beside you? The evening light was warm and gold, and the white roses moved slightly in the breeze. And Faith Everwin, who had spent 7 years behind locked glass, becoming precisely and entirely herself, felt tears come, not from grief. Yes, she said, simply, completely, the way true things were said. High above them, the northern tower window stood open. It had been open for 7 months. It would remain open for the rest of her life, not because she had been rescued, because she had chosen, finally, freely, with her whole self and no locked door in sight, to let the light in. And this time, the choice had been entirely hers. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.